They bound her at sunrise and called it justice. By nightfall, the man who mocked her would forget how to speak. The desert woke slow that morning, a pale light spilling over miles of dust and dry grass, the kind that crunches under a boot like old paper, the kind that remembers every step. Ethan Cole stood with his rifle resting easy in his hands, boots planted firm in the sand just outside the makeshift camp, watching as two men tightened the rope around the wooden post. The woman didn't resist. That was the first thing he noticed.
No struggle. No pleading.
Just stillness, like a stone that had decided long ago it would not move for anyone. They called her a princess, but not with respect. The word rolled off their tongues like a joke they'd told too many times, something meant to shrink her, to turn her into something small enough to control. Ethan had heard it before. He'd used it himself. Apache princess, he muttered under his breath, adjusting his grip, eyes narrowing as he studied her. She stood barefoot in the dust, wrists bound, long dark hair catching the morning light like threads of ink against gold. Around her neck, a thin cord had once held something. He could see the mark where it used to rest, but now it was gone, taken, probably tossed into someone's pocket without a second thought. That's how things worked out here. You took what you could. You showed strength. Or you disappeared. Ethan believed that. He'd been raised on it. Strength meant control. Strength meant never hesitating. Strength meant being the man others stepped aside for. He shifted his weight, glancing toward the line of soldiers behind him, men like him, dust-covered, sunburned, each carrying the same quiet confidence that came from following orders without question. The officer gave a short nod.
Not now.
Later. Always later. The kind of waiting that stretched minutes into something heavier. Ethan looked back at her. She hadn't lowered her gaze. That was the second thing.
Most people did.
Most people, when tied to a post in the middle of nowhere with armed men circling, would look down, look away, look for mercy in the dirt. She didn't. Her eyes met his, steady, unblinking, as if she were the one deciding what happened next. It unsettled him more than he liked to admit. You understand what's happening? He asked, voice low, not unkind, but not gentle either. The wind moved between them, carrying the dry scent of leather and sun-warmed wood. She tilted her head just slightly, studying him the way a teacher might study a student who had given the wrong answer, but didn't yet know it. You think this is strength, she said, her English clear, quiet, each word landing without force, but impossible to ignore. Ethan let out a short breath, almost a laugh. It's order, he replied. Out here, that's the same thing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere beyond the camp, a horse shifted, the soft jingle of reins breaking the silence. The sun climbed higher, pressing heat down onto the earth, onto their shoulders, into their skin. Then she spoke again. No, she said. It's noise. The word hung there, light but sharp, like something that didn't need to be loud to cut. Ethan felt it, though he didn't show it. He had learned long ago not to show anything that could be mistaken for doubt. He stepped closer, boots leaving shallow prints in the dust, stopping just a few feet from her. Close enough to see the fine lines of dirt across her hands, the faint rise and fall of her breath, the calm that didn't match the situation. You don't know me, he said. You don't know what strength is. Her gaze didn't shift. Not an inch. I know what it isn't, she replied. The officer called out something behind him, a reminder of time, of schedule, of decisions waiting to be made. Ethan didn't turn. Not yet. There was something in the way she stood there, unshaken, that made the rest of the world feel less certain. He noticed then the faint imprint around her neck again, the place where the missing pendant had been, and for a brief second, just a flicker, something stirred in his memory, something he couldn't quite place, like a word on the edge of recall. He pushed it aside. Didn't matter. Nothing did except the next order, the next step, the next proof of who he was. That's what he told himself. Still, he didn't move away. And neither did she. The desert held its breath, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole wasn't entirely sure who was standing on stronger ground. The order came just after the sun cleared the ridge, sharp and simple, the kind that left no room for thought. Move her by noon. Judgment at first light tomorrow. The officer's voice carried across the camp like a line drawn in sand, clean, final. Men nodded without looking up, hands busy with reins, canteens, the quiet routines that made decisions feel smaller than they were. Ethan Cole heard it all and said nothing. He stood where he was, a few feet from her, as if the ground had decided to hold him there. The woman did not react to the order. Not in the way he expected. No tightening of her shoulders. No quick breath. Just that same stillness, like she had already stepped beyond whatever they thought they were about to do. It made the air feel different. Thicker. Harder to breathe. You heard him, Ethan said, more to himself than to her, but his eyes stayed on hers. Morning comes fast out here. She did not answer right away. A breeze moved through the camp, lifting dust in a slow spiral that caught the light before settling again. Somewhere behind them, a man laughed at something small, something ordinary, and the sound felt out of place. The sun always comes, she said finally. That does not make it justice. Ethan shifted his jaw, the muscle tightening without permission. He had heard words like that before from preachers, from men who thought too much and survived too little. But coming from her, tied to a post with nothing to bargain with, it landed differently. You think you are above it, he said. Above what happens out here. She studied him again, that same quiet focus, like she was listening to something under his words instead of the words themselves.
No, she said.
I think you are afraid of what happens inside you. The sentence settled between them, not loud, not forced, but it stayed. Ethan looked away for the first time, just for a second, toward the line of wagons, the horses shifting under the rising heat. Afraid was not a word he carried, not one he allowed. Fear was something you used to control others, not something you admitted to yourself. He stepped back, creating distance, as if space could put things back in order. You do not know anything about me, he said, his voice firmer now, the tone he used when things needed to fall back into place. I know enough, she replied. You hold a weapon and call it strength. You follow a voice and call it honor. But you have not asked what you are protecting. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled. Protecting. The word stirred something again, faint but present, like that half-memory from before.
He pushed it down harder this time. We protect people, he said. Settlements.
Families. Order. She glanced toward the horizon, where the land stretched wide and empty, no fences, no markers, just miles of open ground that belonged to whoever could cross it. Then why do you look like a man who has lost something? She asked. He almost answered. The reflex rose quick, sharp, ready to defend, to correct, to put her back in the place she was supposed to stay. But the words did not come. Not the right ones. Not fast enough. The officer called his name then, louder this time. Cole. Ethan turned halfway, enough to acknowledge, not enough to leave. Yes, sir. You're on watch tonight, the officer said. Keep her steady. No trouble. Ethan nodded once. Yes, sir. The officer moved on, boots crunching across dry ground, already thinking about something else. Orders given. Day moving forward. Ethan turned back. She had not moved. Not an inch. You will be moved soon, he said. Better for you if you stay quiet. A pause. Then, softer, before he could stop himself. Better for everyone. She held his gaze, and for a moment, something in her expression shifted. Not fear. Not defiance. Something closer to understanding, but not the kind that comforted. There is no better, she said. Only truth. It comes whether you are ready or not. The wind picked up again, stronger now, carrying heat across the camp in slow waves. Ethan felt it press against his back, against his chest, as if the land itself was leaning in, listening. He glanced once more at the place around her neck, where the cord had been, that faint line, against her skin, and the memory pulled harder this time, clearer, though still incomplete. A hand, a voice, a moment he had not thought about in years. He swallowed it down, straightened his shoulders, and stepped away. Distance. That was how you kept things simple. That was how you stayed strong. Still, as he walked back toward the line of men, rifle steady at his side, He could feel it following him, not her eyes, not her words, but the questions she had left behind, quiet as dust settling in the sun, waiting for him to notice that it had never left at all. The sun dropped slow behind the ridge, bleeding gold across the dry earth, and by the time the shadows stretched long enough to swallow the camp, Ethan Cole had already taken his post. Night came quiet out here, not soft, but empty, the kind of silence that made every small sound carry farther than it should. A boot shifting, a horse breathing, the faint creak of leather pulled tight over bone. He stood a few yards from her, rifle resting low, eyes scanning the edges of the camp more out of habit than concern. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Still, he watched. That was what he knew how to do. The others settled into their routines, low voices, muted laughter, the clink of tin cups as coffee passed from hand to hand. Ordinary things. Things meant to remind a man he was part of something steady. Ethan did not join them. He stayed where the light from the small fire barely reached, where her outline stood against the darker stretch of night beyond. She had not spoken since the afternoon. Not a word. Not a complaint. Just that same still presence, like the desert itself had shaped her and left her there to endure whatever came next. He told himself it made things easier. A quiet prisoner. No trouble.
No complication. But the truth sat heavier than that.
It made things harder. Silence gave space for thought, and thought had a way of turning simple orders into something else entirely. He shifted his weight, boots pressing into the cooling sand, and glanced toward her again. The rope held her steady against the post, but nothing about her seemed restrained.
Her shoulders were relaxed.
Her breathing.
Slow.
Even now, she looked like someone who had chosen to be exactly where she stood. "You do not sleep," she said, her voice cutting clean through the dark, not loud, but certain. Ethan did not startle. He had been expecting it, in a way he could not explain.
Not on watch, he replied.
That is the point. A pause followed, filled with the low crackle of the fire and the distant call of something moving far out beyond the camp. Or maybe, she said, you are afraid to close your eyes. Ethan let out a slow breath, more through his nose than his mouth, steady, controlled. You like that word, he said. Afraid. It is the only one you refuse to hear, she answered. He looked at her then, really looked, letting his eyes adjust to the faint outline of her face in the dim light. You think you know me, he said again, quieter now, less force behind it. I think you know yourself, she replied. And you do not like what you see. The words settled deeper this time, not because they were louder, but because they came without effort, like she was stating something already decided. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle, then loosened it again, the motion small but deliberate. He had faced men with guns, men with anger, men who shouted and threatened and made themselves large. This was different. There was nothing to push against, no edge to meet, just that steady presence that did not move when he tried to define it. He stepped closer without thinking, closing the space between them until he could see more than just her outline. The faint reflection of firelight in her eyes, the dust on her skin, the mark around her neck, clearer now in the shifting glow. It pulled at him again, that memory, sharper this time, closer to the surface. What was it? He asked suddenly, the question coming before he could shape it. The thing you were wearing. She did not look down. It was not a thing, she said. It was a promise. Ethan frowned slightly. Looks like it is gone. Nothing that matters is ever gone, she replied. Only forgotten. The word struck something loose. Forgotten. He felt it then, not as a full memory but as a feeling, a moment out of place with the man he had become. A smaller hand in his. A voice speaking softly in a language he had not understood, but had trusted anyway. The smell of smoke and herbs. The sense of being kept safe without being told why. He blinked once, hard, as if that would push it back where it belonged. You speak like you know something about me, he said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. I know what the land remembers, she said. And what men try to forget. The fire behind him shifted, sending a brief flare of light across them both, and for a second, her face was clear. Calm. Certain. Unmoved by the rope, the camp, the men who believed they held her fate. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but something close to it, something that did not fit the shape of the world he had built. "You should rest," he said finally, the words coming out quieter than he intended. "Morning will come soon." She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging something he had not said out loud. "Yes," she said. "It always does." Ethan stepped back again, returning to his place at the edge of the light, rifle steady, posture firm, every part of him arranged the way it had always been. But the night did not feel the same anymore. The silence was no longer empty. It carried something with it now, something that had begun to surface and would not be pushed back down so easily. And as the hours stretched toward dawn, Ethan Cole remained awake, not because it was his duty, but because for the first time in years, he was no longer certain what he would do when the sun rose. The sky began to pale long before the sun showed itself, a thin gray light stretching across the horizon like something waking up slow and careful, and the camp followed in quiet pieces, men rising from blankets, boots finding the ground, the soft rhythm of morning settling and without ceremony. But Ethan Cole had never truly slept, not even for a moment, and now he stood where he had stood all night, watching the line where darkness gave way to day, knowing that whatever came next would not wait any longer. The officer's voice cut through the early stillness. Not loud, just certain, calling men into place, calling the moment forward, and Ethan felt it in his chest before he moved, that tightening, that weight that had no name he wanted to say out loud, because once you named it, it became real, and real things demanded answers. He turned back toward her, and she was already awake, if she had ever slept at all, standing the same as before, calm, unshaken, as if the coming morning belonged to her more than it did to the men preparing to decide her fate. The rope still held her wrists, the post still stood behind her, but nothing about her felt confined, and that unsettled him more now than it had the day before. "It is time," he said, though he did not know if he was telling her or himself, and she nodded once, slow, acknowledging the truth of it without giving it weight. The men gathered in a loose circle, not tight, not formal, but enough to turn attention into something that could not be ignored, boots pressing into dust that had seen too many moments like this and remembered none of them. Ethan stepped forward because that was where he was supposed to be, where his place had always been, between order and action, the man who made things happen when others hesitated, and for years that had been enough, more than enough. But now each step felt heavier, like the ground was asking him something he had never been asked before. The officer stood a few feet away, hands behind his back, posture straight, voice ready, and when he spoke, it carried the weight of habit, of rules that had been followed so long no one questioned where they came from. "We finish this now," he said, and a few men nodded, eyes shifting between Ethan and the woman, waiting, always waiting for the one who would move first. Ethan looked at her, and she met his gaze the same way she always had, steady, clear, without fear, without anger, without anything that made this easier for him. And for a moment the world narrowed down to just that space. Between them, the distance of a few feet that felt wider than the miles of desert surrounding them. "Do you understand what is about to happen?" he asked, the question coming out different this time, quieter. Not as a statement, not as a command, but as something closer to a need. She did not answer right away, and the silence stretched, thin and tight, until even the wind seemed to hold back. Then she spoke, her voice the same as before, calm, certain, carrying no weight of the moment that pressed down on everyone else. "I understand what you are choosing," she said. The words landed deeper than anything before, not because they were louder, but because they turned everything back on him, stripped away the distance he had tried to keep, made it clear that this was not about orders, not about rules, not about anything outside of him. Ethan felt it then, that memory breaking through fully, no longer a shadow, no longer something he could push aside, but clear and undeniable, a small cabin, the smell of smoke and herbs, a woman's hands steady and careful, placing something around his neck, a thin cord, a piece of turquoise catching the light, her voice soft as she spoke words he had not understood but had trusted, because in that moment, he had been weak, sick, close to something he could not name, and she had not taken advantage of that, had not demanded anything in return, had simply protected what was in front of her without asking who he was or where he came from. He blinked, the present rushing back and around him, the circle of men, the officer waiting, the woman before him whose eyes now held something different, not surprise, not triumph, just recognition, like she had been waiting for him to remember. That pendant, he said, his voice low, almost lost in the open air, it belonged to someone who saved my life. She inclined her head slightly, as if confirming something already known. My grandmother, she said. The words settled everything, not with force, but with clarity, connecting past to present in a way that left no space for doubt, no room to pretend this was just another order. Just another day, the officer shifted, impatience creeping into his stance, the moment stretching longer than it should, and he looked to Ethan, expecting movement, expecting the man he had always been. Ethan felt the weight of every eye on him, the expectation, the history, the identity he had built piece by piece, decision by decision, and for a second, he could see both paths clearly, one that followed everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, and one that did not. One that asked something harder, something quieter, something that did not come with approval or certainty. He lowered his gaze for just a moment, not to the ground, but to the space between them, to the place where the dust shifted with each breath of wind. And then he looked back up, meeting her eyes again. And in that instant, the question was no longer what he was ordered to do, but what kind of man he was willing to be when no one else could answer for him. No one spoke when Ethan moved, and that silence said more than any order ever could, because every man in that circle knew something had shifted, even if they could not name it, even if they refused to see it. The officer's voice came again, sharper now, cutting through the stillness, calling Ethan back to the line he had always held. Cole, he said, firm, expecting obedience, expecting the same man who had never hesitated before. And for a moment, that expectation hung in the air like a weight waiting to drop. Ethan did not look at him. Not yet. His eyes remained on her, on Nayeli, on the woman who stood without fear, without anger, without asking for anything, and that was what made it impossible to continue as if nothing had changed. His hand moved, slow, deliberate, not toward his rifle, not toward any sign of force, but toward the rope at her wrists. And even that small motion felt louder than a gunshot in the quiet morning. A few men shifted their stance, boots pressing deeper into the dust, the sound of leather tightening, not in threat, but in uncertainty, because this was not how things were supposed to go. Ethan paused just short of touching the rope, his fingers hovering there, as if crossing that final inch would mean stepping into something he could not return from, and maybe it would. The officer took a step forward then, his voice carrying that edge again. That is not your call, he said, each word measured, controlled, but beneath it was something else, something closer to warning. Then command. Ethan finally turned his head, just enough to acknowledge him, but not enough to break the moment. It is now, he said, and the words came out steady, not loud, not defiant, just certain, and that certainty was new, even to him. The officer studied him for a second longer than usual, weighing the situation, weighing the man in front of him, and in that brief pause, the entire camp seemed to lean in, waiting to see which version of Ethan Cole would step forward. The one they knew, or the one they did not yet understand. Ethan did not wait for permission, not this time. His hand closed around the rope, the fibers rough against his skin, real, undeniable, and with a single, controlled motion, he loosened it, not rushed, not dramatic, just enough for it to fall away from her wrists, as if it had never belonged there in the first place. No one moved. Not the officer, not the men, not even the wind for a moment. And in that stillness, something far greater than authority shifted, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Nayeli did not step away immediately. She simply lowered her hands, free now, and looked at Ethan, not with gratitude, not with triumph, but with the same quiet recognition she had held from the beginning, as if this had never been about her survival, but about his choice. You see now, she said softly, and Ethan exhaled. A breath he had not realized he had been holding, because for the first time, the weight in his chest was not something he was trying to push down, but something he was finally willing to carry. Behind him, a man shifted, then another, small movements, uncertain, not challenging, not yet, but no longer as solid as they had been before, because when one man steps away from the line itself begins to question where it stands. The officer did not speak again, not immediately, and that silence was its own kind of answer, because even authority has limits when faced with something it cannot fully control. Nayeli turned then, slow, deliberate, and began to walk, not hurried, not looking back, her steps light against the dust as if the earth itself welcomed her passage, and Ethan did not stop her, did not call out, did not reach again. He simply stood where he was, watching her go, understanding now that strength had never been in holding someone in place, but in knowing when to let them walk free. The sun rose fully over the horizon, casting long light across the camp, and for the first time since he had arrived in this land, Ethan Cole did not feel like he was standing on solid ground, but he also knew, without question, that he had never stood more firmly in his life. No one tried to stop her, and that was the strangest part of all, because a moment earlier, every man there had believed they knew exactly how this morning would end, and now they stood in a silence that did not belong to them anymore, watching a woman walk away without chains, without fear, without looking back, and somehow that felt heavier than any command ever given. Ethan Cole remained where he was, his hands at his sides, his rifle untouched, as if the weight he carried now had nothing to do with metal or orders, but something far less visible and far more permanent. The officer finally moved, slow, deliberate, stepping into the space that had just been broken, his boots pressing into the same dust that had held their certainty only minutes before, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, controlled, but not as firm as it had been. "You understand what you have done," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Ethan did not turn immediately, his eyes still following the path Nayeli had taken, watching as her figure grew smaller against the wide stretch of desert, until she became part of the land itself, something that could not be separated from it. "Yes," he said finally, his voice even, not defensive, not proud, just clear. The officer studied him, searching for something, maybe doubt, maybe regret, but whatever he was looking for, he did not find it, and that absence unsettled him more than defiance ever could. "There are consequences," the officer added, and this time it sounded closer to a warning, something meant to bring the moment back into a shape he could control. Ethan nodded once, slow, acknowledging the truth of it without stepping away from it. "There always are," he replied. Around them, the other men shifted, not stepping forward, not stepping back, caught somewhere in between, because they had seen something they could not easily explain, and once a man sees that, he cannot return to not seeing it. One of them, younger than the rest, glanced from Ethan to the empty horizon and back again, his expression uncertain, as if he had just realized that strength might not be what he had been taught it was, and that realization had no clear place to settle. The officer exhaled through his nose, a quiet release of something he did not name, and after a long pause, he gave a short nod, not approval, not agreement, just an acknowledgement that the moment had passed beyond him. "Break camp," he said, turning away, his voice carrying enough authority to pull the men back into motion, into something familiar, something they could hold on to. Slowly, the camp came back to life, not as it had been before, but enough to move forward, men gathering gear, tightening straps, preparing to leave a place that no longer felt the same. Ethan remained still for a few seconds longer, letting the morning settle around him, the sun now fully risen, casting long shadows that stretched behind him like reminders of who he had been. Then he bent down, brushing his fingers lightly against the ground where the rope had fallen, not picking it up, just feeling the roughness of it, the simplicity of something that had once defined strength in his world. And, realizing how little it meant now, he straightened slowly, lifting his gaze to the open land ahead, wide, endless, unforgiving, and yet, for the first time, It did not feel like something that needed to be controlled, only something that needed to be understood. Somewhere in the distance, beyond what he could see, a faint movement caught the light, too far to define, but enough for him to know she was still there, still walking, still free. And he did not follow, did not call out, because he understood now that some paths were not meant to be shared, only respected. Ethan Cole turned back toward the camp, toward the men, toward whatever consequences waited, and as he took his first step, it felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just as chosen in a way it had never been before. And out here, where words often meant less than actions, that was the only kind of strength that truly remained. The camp moved on before the sun reached its peak, wagons creaking, horses stepping steady across the dry ground, and dust rising in long, thin trails that blurred the line between where they had been and where they were going. But something lingered behind them, something none of the men spoke about, though each of them carried it in his own way. Ethan Cole rode near the middle of the line, not at the front where orders were given, not at the back where men drifted into quiet talk, just somewhere in between, where he had always fit best. But even that place felt different now, like it no longer belonged to the same man. The rhythm of the horse beneath him was familiar, steady, each step measured, each mile folding into the next, and for years that had been enough to quiet his thoughts, to keep everything in its proper place. But today the silence did not settle the same way. It stretched wider, deeper, leaving room for things he had never allowed before. He glanced once toward the horizon, not searching, not expecting, just noticing. The way the land opened out in all directions, endless and indifferent, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to claim it, to control it, to define it. He simply saw it. A rider pulled up beside him, the younger man from earlier, his posture unsure, his eyes shifting between Ethan and the road ahead, as if measuring something he could not quite name. "Cole," the man said, his voice low enough that it would not carry. "What you did back there?" He paused, searching for the right word. "Was that right?" Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, because the question was not simple, not the kind that fit into the rules they had been given, and for a moment, he considered saying what he would have said before, something clear, something certain, something that would put the world back into order. Instead, he let the silence sit between them, the sound of hooves against earth filling the space where words usually went. "It was necessary," he said finally, but even as he spoke, he knew the word did not carry the full weight of it. The younger man frowned slightly, not convinced, not dismissive, just uncertain, and after a moment, he nodded once, as if accepting that some answers were not meant to be fully understood, at least not yet. He eased his horse back, leaving Ethan alone again, but not in the same way as before, because now the quiet around him felt less like isolation and more like something he had chosen. The officer rode ahead, his back straight, his posture unchanged, but there was a difference there too, subtle, almost invisible, in the way he did not look back, did not call out, as if he had decided that whatever had happened that morning was not something he could undo, only something he would have to carry in his own way. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, pressing heat down onto the land until the air itself seemed to shimmer, and still the line of riders moved forward, steady, disciplined, but not untouched. Ethan reached into his pocket without thinking, his fingers brushing against something small, something he had taken without fully knowing why, and when he pulled it out, the light caught it just right, a piece of turquoise wrapped in worn cord, simple, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it meant, but to him, it carried a weight far beyond its size. He turned it once between his fingers, the surface smooth from years of wear, and for a moment, he could almost hear that voice again, soft, steady, speaking words he had not understood then but felt now with a clarity that needed no translation. He closed his hand around it, not hiding it, not displaying it, just holding it, letting it rest there as a reminder of something he had nearly forgotten and had been given back in a way he could not ignore. The line of riders crested a low ridge, and beyond it, the land stretched even wider, open and uncertain, the kind a place where a man could lose himself or find something he did not know he was missing, and as Ethan Cole rode forward into that space, he understood that whatever came next would not be decided by orders alone, but by the choices he was willing to make when no one else could make them for him. And out here, under a sky that offered no answers, that was the only kind of truth that mattered. By late afternoon, the heat had settled deep into the earth, the kind that rose back up through a horse's hooves and into a man's bones, and the column slowed as the officer called for a brief halt near a dry creek bed where a thin line of cottonwoods offered just enough shade to make the stop feel earned. Men dismounted with quiet relief, stretching backs, loosening reins, moving through small, familiar motions that made the day feel manageable again. But even in rest, there was a difference now. A space where something unspoken had taken root. Ethan Cole led his horse to the edge of the shade and tied the reins to a low branch, his movements steady, practiced, yet his attention drifted beyond the camp, past the thin line of trees to the open stretch of land that shimmered under the sun. He could hear the murmur of voices behind him, low conversations picking up where silence had left them, but he did not turn. Not yet, because the quiet ahead of him held more weight than the noise. Behind, he reached into his pocket again, fingers finding the turquoise pendant without searching, and this time he let it rest in his palm, turning it slowly as the light caught its surface, the color deep and calm, like something that had nothing to prove. "You plan on keeping that?" a voice said from behind him, and Ethan did not need to turn to know it was the officer. He closed his hand around the pendant before facing him, not hiding it, just holding it the way a man holds something that belongs to him in a way words cannot explain. "Yes," he said simply. The officer stepped closer, stopping just inside the shade, his eyes moving from Ethan's face to his closed hand and back again, measuring, not accusing, but not indifferent either. "You understand that what happened this morning does not disappear just because the day moves on," he said, his tone even, carrying the weight of someone used to being heard. Ethan nodded once. "I understand," he replied, and there was no hesitation in it now, no searching for the right answer, only the truth as he had come to know it. The officer studied him for another moment, then exhaled quietly, a sound that held more thought than frustration. "Men follow examples," he said, glancing briefly toward the others, "whether they are meant to or not." Ethan followed his gaze, watching as a few of the younger soldiers moved about their tasks, their motions a little less certain than before, their eyes occasionally lifting toward him without meaning to. And he understood what the officer was saying without needing it spelled out. "Then maybe it matters what they see," Ethan said, turning back, his voice calm, not challenging, just clear. The officer held his gaze, and for a second, something passed between them that had nothing to do with rank or command, something quieter, harder to define, and then it was gone, replaced by the familiar structure of their roles. "We move again in 10 minutes, the officer said, stepping back into the light. Leaving Ethan alone at the edge of the shade, Ethan watched him go, then looked down at the pendant in his hand, opening his fingers just enough to let the light fall across it again, and for a moment, he could almost feel the weight of that earlier time, the hands that had placed it, the quiet strength that had never needed to announce itself. He slipped it back into his pocket, not as something hidden, but as something carried, and turned toward his horse, loosening the reins, preparing to move with the others. When the column set out again, the rhythm returned, steady and familiar, but the land ahead no longer felt like something to conquer or contain. It felt like something that held its own truths, waiting for those willing to see them. Ethan rode forward with the others, the dust rising around them in soft clouds, and though the path stretched uncertain into the distance, he no longer looked at it as a line drawn by orders alone, but as something shaped by the choices a man made when no one else could make them for him. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where the land met the sky in a quiet, unbroken line, he knew that the lesson he had been given had not ended that morning. It had only begun. The light began to soften as evening approached, stretching shadows long across the open land, and the column slowed once more. Not by command this time, but by the quiet understanding that men could only push so far before the day asked something back from them. They made camp near a low rise where the wind moved steady but not harsh, enough to carry heat away and leave the air cooler than it had been all afternoon, and one by one, the men settled into place, routine returning in pieces, fires lit, canteens passed, voices low and familiar again, but never quite the same as before. Ethan Cole dismounted without a word, tying his horse near the edge of the camp, his movements efficient, practiced, yet his attention drifted beyond the circle of men, toward the horizon where the last light held onto the sky like something reluctant to leave. He walked a few steps farther out, just enough to stand apart without drawing notice, and there he paused, boots planted in the cooling earth, listening to the sound of the wind as it moved across the open ground, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and distant water. It was quiet in a way that did not feel empty, a kind of stillness that held something beneath it, something waiting. He reached into his pocket again, the motion now familiar, and brought out the turquoise pendant, turning it slowly between his fingers as the fading light caught its surface, deep and steady, unchanged by the day that had passed. For a moment, he simply held it there, not thinking, not questioning, just feeling the weight of it, the presence of something that had existed long before him and would remain long after, something that did not need to prove its strength to be known. Behind him, the camp shifted, a few voices rising slightly, laughter carried on the wind, and then fading again, but none of it pulled him back, not yet. Instead, he looked out across the land, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider something he had avoided his entire life, not what he was ordered to do, not what was expected of him, but what he believed when no one else was there to define it for him. The thought did not come easy. It did not arrive as a clear answer or a steady truth. It came as a question, quiet and persistent, the kind that did not demand immediate resolution but refused to be ignored. What does a man protect when there is no one watching? He closed his hand around the pendant again, the smooth surface pressing into his palm, grounding him in a way nothing else had that day, and as he stood there, the memory returned once more, clearer now, not just the feeling, but the moment itself, the woman who had saved him, the calm in her eyes, the way she had acted without hesitation, without fear, not because she was stronger in the way he had understood strength, but because she had chosen to protect something beyond herself. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and in that quiet release, something settled inside him, not a final answer, not a certainty, but a direction, a sense that the path ahead would not be shaped by orders alone. A figure moved at the edge of his vision, then, not close, not part of the camp, just a distant silhouette against the fading light, still enough to almost be mistaken for part of the land itself, and Ethan did not reach for his rifle, did not call out. He simply watched, recognizing without needing confirmation that some presences did not come to threaten or to challenge, but to remind. The figure remained only a moment longer, then turned, disappearing into the deepening dusk as quietly as it had appeared, leaving no trace behind except the feeling that something had been seen, something acknowledged without words. Ethan slipped the pendant back into his pocket, his fingers lingering there for a second before falling to his side, and then he turned, walking back toward the camp, toward the firelight, toward the men who would continue forward with him, each carrying their own version of the day that had changed something they might not yet understand. He took his place among them once more, not separate, not removed, but no longer the same, and as the night settled over the land, quiet and wide, Ethan Cole understood that strength was not something a man declared or proved in a single moment. It was something he chose again and again, in silence. In small decisions, in the space where no one else could see, and out here, under a sky that offered no judgment and no approval, that was the only kind of strength that would last. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, its light no longer stretching far enough to claim the edges of the camp, leaving the land beyond in a quiet darkness that felt neither empty nor threatening, just present, like something watching without judgment, and the men settled into sleep one by one, their breathing steady, their bodies surrendering to the exhaustion of the day, but Ethan Cole remained awake, seated just outside the reach of the fading glow, his back against a worn saddle, his Eyes lifted toward the open sky where the stars had begun to fill every inch of space above him. Out here, there were no walls, no ceilings, nothing to break the vastness, and for the first time, he did not feel small beneath it. He felt clear, as if something inside him had finally found room to breathe. The pendant rested in his hand again, not because he had forgotten to put it away, but because he had chosen to hold on to it, to keep that quiet reminder close. And as he turned it slowly between his fingers, he found himself no longer searching for answers, but listening for something deeper, something that did not come in words. The wind moved gently across the camp, brushing against canvas, stirring ash, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth, and in that movement, Ethan felt a strange sense of stillness, as if the world around him had settled into its true shape, one that had always been there, waiting for him to notice. He thought back to the morning, to the moment, when everything had narrowed down to a single choice, and he realized now that it had not been about defiance, not about breaking away from orders or proving anything to the men around him. It had been about recognition, about seeing clearly what stood in front of him and choosing not to turn away from it. The officer's words echoed faintly in his mind. Consequences, responsibility, the weight of actions that did not disappear with time, and Ethan did not reject them, did not try to lessen their meaning. He accepted them as part of the same truth he had stepped into, because strength, real strength, did not avoid consequence. It carried it. A quiet sound reached him then, not from the camp, but from beyond it, a shift in the air, a presence that did not belong to the circle of men and firelight, and Ethan did not move to stand, did not reach for his rifle. He simply listened, his senses open in a way they had never been before. The sound came again, soft, almost lost in the wind, and then a figure appeared at the edge of the darkness, just within sight, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to ignore. And though the night concealed the details, Ethan knew without doubt who it was. Nayeli stood there for a moment, still and silent, as if the distance between them was not measured in yards but in understanding, and Ethan rose slowly to his feet, not out of caution, but out of respect, his movements calm, unhurried. Neither of them spoke at first, the silence stretching between them, not empty, but full, carrying everything that had passed and everything that had yet to be said. Then she stepped forward, just enough for the starlight to catch her face, her expression unchanged, steady, certain. But now there was something else there too, something quieter, something that acknowledged the path he had chosen. "You remembered," she said, her voice low, blending with the night, and Ethan nodded once, the motion simple, but it carried more weight than any explanation could. "Not soon." "Enough," he replied, and she regarded him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful, as if measuring the truth of that statement not by its words, but by what lay beneath them. "Soon enough to choose," she said, and there was no judgment in it, no praise, just the simple recognition of what had been done. Ethan looked down briefly, then back at her, the question rising without force, without urgency, but with a quiet need to understand. "What happens now?" he asked, not as a soldier, not as a man seeking orders, but as someone standing at the edge of something new. Nayeli did not answer right away, her eyes lifting briefly toward the sky, as if the answer was written there in a way that did not require explanation, and then she looked back at him, her voice steady. "Now you live with what you know," she said. The words settled over him, not heavy, not light, just true, and Ethan felt something shift again, not a change this time, but a confirmation, as if the path he had stepped onto had finally taken shape beneath his feet. Nayeli held his gaze for one more moment, then turned, her figure blending back into the darkness as quietly as it had appeared, leaving no trace behind except the understanding she had placed before him. Ethan stood there a while longer, the night stretching wide around him, the stars unmoving above, and when he finally sat back down, the pendant still in his hand, he no longer looked at it as something given, something borrowed from another time, but as something earned, not through strength as he had once defined it, but through the choice to see, to understand, and to act without needing to prove anything at all. Morning returned without announcement, just a slow lifting of darkness into light. the sky turning from deep blue to pale gray, then to that thin gold line that stretched across the horizon like something steady and inevitable, and Ethan Cole was already awake when it came, sitting where he had been, the fire reduced to faint embers, the air cool enough to remind him that night had truly passed. The camp stirred around him in quiet layers, men rising, boots finding the ground, the familiar rhythm returning as if nothing had changed, but Ethan could feel it now. The difference, subtle but real, like a shift in the ground that only mattered if you knew where to look. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his coat, the pendant resting in his hand for a moment before he tucked it away, not hidden, just kept close, and when he turned back toward the others, his movements were the same as they had always been, steady, controlled. But something beneath them had settled into place. The officer approached without calling his name, his steps measured, his expression unreadable in the early light, and when he stopped a few feet away, there was no immediate command, no correction, just a moment of quiet that stretched longer than it needed. We ride in 10 minutes, he said finally, his voice even, carrying the authority of habit, but not pressing beyond it. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging, and for a second, neither of them moved, as if both understood that what had passed between them the day before did not require repetition, only acceptance. The officer studied him briefly, then gave a short nod in return, not approval, not agreement, just recognition, and turned away without another word. Around them, the men prepared to move, saddles tightened, reins adjusted, the sounds of leather and metal blending into the morning air, and yet there was a difference in the way some of them glanced toward Ethan, not openly, not with challenge, but with a kind of quiet awareness, as if they had seen something they could not fully explain and were still deciding what it meant. Ethan moved through the motions with them, checking his horse, adjusting his gear, every action familiar, every step known, but the purpose behind them had shifted, not in what he did, but in why he did it. When the column finally set out, the sun had risen fully, casting light across the land that revealed every detail without favor or judgment, and Ethan rode forward with the others, the rhythm returning beneath him, steady and sure, but no longer something that carried him without thought. Instead, each mile felt chosen. Each step something he stepped into rather than something that carried him along. The land stretched wide ahead, open and unchanged, and yet it no longer felt like something to be measured or controlled. It felt like something that existed on its own terms, something that did not need him to define it. Hours passed, the heat building again, the line of riders moving forward across the same kind of ground they had crossed the day before, and still, Ethan found himself looking at it differently, not searching for signs of movement or threat, but noticing the details he had once ignored, the way the wind moved across the grass, the way the light shifted against the hills, the way the silence held more than emptiness. At one point, he reached into his pocket again, his fingers brushing the pendant, and he did not take it out this time. He simply felt it there, a quiet presence, a reminder that strength did not need to be displayed to exist. The younger soldier from before rode nearby again, not speaking, not asking questions this time, just riding, his posture a little straighter, his gaze a little more thoughtful, and Ethan understood without words that something had been passed on, not through instruction, not through command, but through example, the kind that stayed with a man long after the moment had passed. As the day moved forward, the column continued on its path, the same as always in appearance, but beneath that, something had shifted, something that would not be undone by distance or time, because once a man sees clearly, truly sees, he cannot return to what he believed before, and as Ethan Cole rode beneath the open sky, the weight he carried was no longer something he resisted, it was something he accepted, not as a burden, but as the shape of the man he had chosen to become, a man who understood now that strength was not found in control, but in the quiet decision to act with clarity when it mattered most, even when no one else understood why. By the time the sun reached its highest point again, the land had changed in a way no map could show, not in shape or distance, but in how it was carried by the men moving across it, and Ethan Cole felt that shift most clearly when the column crested a long ridge and paused, not by command, but by instinct, as if the ground itself had asked them to stop and look. Below them stretched a wide valley, open and still, a thin ribbon of water cutting through the dust like a quiet promise, and for a moment no one spoke, because some sights did not need words. They simply settled into a man and stayed there. Ethan guided his horse a few steps forward, letting it stand at the edge, its breath steady, its ears flicking toward the distant sound of wind moving through grass, and he took in the view without measuring it, without thinking of routes or control or strategy, just seeing it for what it was, something whole, something that did not belong to him or to anyone else. The officer rode up. Beside him, not too close. Not distant either, his posture unchanged, but his silence different now, less like authority waiting to be used and more like a man considering something he had not yet named. "We passed through here," he said after a moment, his voice even, as if the words were part of a larger thought he was still forming, and Ethan nodded, his eyes still on the valley below, understanding the meaning beneath the statement. Not just direction, but acknowledgement, a quiet agreement that the path forward would not be taken the same way it once had been. They began the descent slowly, the horses picking careful steps along the slope, the line of riders stretching behind them, each man following the same trail, but not all of them carrying the same weight as before. As they reached the valley floor, the air shifted, cooler, touched by the presence of water, and Ethan felt it immediately, that subtle change that spoke of life without announcing itself. And he dismounted near the edge of the stream, crouching for a moment to let his hand brush the surface, the water moving around his fingers without resistance, without question. It reminded him of something he could not quite put into words, something about strength that did not push or hold, but moved, adapted, remained steady without needing to stand still. Behind him, the men spread out, tending to horses, filling canteens, their movements quieter than usual, as if the place itself asked for it, and Ethan rose slowly, stepping back from the water, his gaze lifting across the valley to where the land began to rise again on the far side. There was no sign of her, no figure at the edge of sight, no presence in the distance, and yet he did not feel the absence as something empty. He felt it as something complete, as if what had needed to be given had already been placed in his hands. He reached into his pocket once more, drawing out the pendant, holding it up briefly so that the sunlight passed through it, the color deep and unwavering, and for a moment, he considered leaving it there, letting it return to the land it came from, but his hand did not open. Instead, he closed his fingers around it again, not out of possession, but out of understanding, because some things were not meant to be left behind, they were meant to be carried forward. The officer's voice came from behind him, not calling, just present. "We move in 5 minutes," and Ethan nodded without turning, slipping the pendant back into his pocket, feeling its presence settle once more against him. When he mounted again, the movement felt the same as it always had, the familiar rise, the steady balance, but the direction ahead no longer felt like something imposed. It felt like something chosen, even within the structure of orders and duty. The column reformed, the lines stretching out once more as they crossed the valley and began the slow climb on the far side, the sound of hooves blending with the wind, the rhythm steady and sure, and as Ethan rode forward, he understood that the lesson he had been given was not something that ended with a single act or a single moment. It was something that would follow him into every choice he made, shaping not just what he did, but who he became. And out here, where the land did not remember names or titles, only the marks a man left behind, that was the only measure that would remain when everything else had faded. The climb out of the valley was slow, the kind that tested patience more than strength, each step measured, each breath steady, and by the time the column reached the ridge above, the sun had begun its descent again, casting long shadows that stretched behind them like quiet reminders of where they had been. Ethan Cole rode near the front now, not by order, not by rank, but by the simple fact that no one had moved to take that place from him. And he did not question it, did not claim it, he simply rode, his posture steady, his gaze forward, the land unfolding ahead in wide, open silence. The wind picked up as they reached the top, carrying with it a cooler edge, a sign that the day was loosening its hold, and Ethan slowed his horse just enough to let the others catch up, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, the kind that came from seeing more than just the path in front of him. The officer drew alongside once more, his presence familiar now in a different way, less like command and more like something shared, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet between them no longer empty, but settled. "You could have done it differently," the officer said at last, his voice low, not accusing, not approving, just stating a truth that had been carried since that morning. Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes still on the horizon. "I know," he replied. A pause followed, the wind moving between them, lifting dust, carrying it away without leaving a mark. "But I would have been a different man," Ethan added. And this time, when he spoke, there was no uncertainty in it, no searching for the right words, only the clarity that had come from standing in that moment and choosing. The officer studied him briefly, then looked ahead again, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way he held himself, a slight shift, as if the weight he carried had been adjusted, not removed, but understood in a new way. "We all choose," he said after a moment, and then he urged his horse forward, rejoining the line without another word. The column moved on, the ridge stretching out before them, the land wide and unbroken, and as they rode, the light softened, turning the dust into something almost golden, something that did not cling, but drifted, carried by the same wind that moved across everything without asking where it came from or where it was going. Ethan reached into his pocket one last time, his fingers closing around the pendant, and this time, he did not take it out. He simply held it there, feeling its presence, steady and quiet, a part of him now in a way that did not need to be shown. He thought of the woman who had given it, of the lesson that had come with it, not spoken as a command, not forced as a rule, but offered in a way that allowed him to choose whether to carry it or leave it behind. And he understood now that the choice had never been about her. It had always been about him. The sun dipped lower, the sky shifting into deeper colors, and the land ahead remained open, uncertain, untouched by anything except the passage of those willing to cross it, and Ethan rode forward into that space without looking back, not because he had forgotten, but because he no longer needed to. The man he had been would have measured strength by what he could control, what he could hold, what he could force into place, but the man he had become understood something quieter, something that did not need to be proven. That strength was found in the moments when a man chose not to take, not to dominate, not to follow blindly, but to stand still long enough to see clearly and act with purpose. The wind moved across the ridge, carrying the sound of hooves into the distance, blending it with the vast silence of the land, and as the light faded and the day gave way to night once more, there were no words left to mark what had changed, no declarations, no final statements, only the steady rhythm of a man riding forward, carrying with him a truth that did not need to be spoken to be known, because out here, where the land remembered nothing and everything at once, the only thing that lasted was the kind of strength a man chose to live by when no one else was there to see it.